Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a piece of human history that is honestly just mind-boggling. We're talking about an entire magnificent city built directly on top of water. We're going to track the engineering history of Venice, following its unbelievable rise from a desperate, muddy refuge to a sprawling maritime empire, and eventually take a hard look at the very real, very modern threats it's facing right now. It really all comes down to this one central question. How do you build a lasting empire on a foundation of mud? I mean, it sounds like a riddle, right? But throughout this explainer, we're going to unpack a 1,500-year-old engineering miracle that literally set the stage for one of history's most fascinating civilizations.
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll start with the initial flight to the swamps, look at the absolute genius behind engineering a floating city, explore the rise of their maritime empire, touch on their golden era of art and innovation before the decline, and finally, confront the modern crisis threatening to sink it all.
Our story kicks off with Section 1, Fleeing to the Swamps.
So, picture this. It's the late 50s-60s, and desperate people are fleeing into the Venetian Lagoon to escape the invading Lombards in northern Italy. Now, this environment was defined by truly harsh conditions. We're talking about a morass of swampy mudflats and scattered islands. For centuries, it was formed by silt outflowing from the Po and Piave rivers and then constantly pushed back and reshaped by the counterforce of the Adriatic currents. It was a constantly shifting, unpredictable, marshy maze. Now, obviously, this made it a totally unstable and frankly terrible place to try and live, but, and this is key, it was the absolute perfect spot to hide from a rampaging army.
Which brings us to Section 2, Engineering a floating city out of that mud.
To actually build something permanent here, they faced a massive logistical nightmare, supporting heavy structures on top of shifting mud. And this brilliantly illustrates their genius, four-step construction process to tame the lagoon. Step 1, they drove clusters of wooden piles measuring anywhere from 1 to 3 meters long deep down into the ground. Step 2, the sheer force of driving those piles in actually squeezed out the groundwater. Step 3, they compacted the mud tightly around those wooden piles. And finally, Step 4, this created a permanent oxygen-free seal.
To really grasp how impressive this is, we have to understand that oxygen-free seal. You can kind of think of it like nature's bubble wrap. By creating this intensely compacted mud environment, the submerged wood was completely protected from insects and fungi. So aside from some minor bacterial damage over the centuries, it made the wood essentially impervious to rot. It is absolutely shocking science, but this sealed system is exactly why these 1,500-year-old wooden foundations are still supporting Venice to this very day. No way, right? Once that incredible foundation was set in place, wooden beams and stone platforms were built right on top of those ancient piles to support the city's heavy structures. They officially declared their new home the Republic of Venice around 697. At first, they just used simple footbridges, but over time, they reinforced the channels into those iconic stone-lined canals navigated by gondolas. What's really fascinating here is how this unique layout actually shaped their entire society. Because unlike the rest of Europe, where nobles rode on horseback literally above the commoners, the geography of Venice forced foot travel for all classes. Rich or poor, everyone walked the exact same streets.
All right, let's move on to Section 3, Building a Maritime Empire. Because the Republic had absolutely zero land for farming, they were entirely dependent on the sea for their survival. But they turned that massive weakness into an incredible strength. Venice's location made it the perfect port city to connect European markets directly to the Silk Road. And those narrow waterways that were so frustrating to navigate, well, they acted as built-in protection from outsiders, while their internal canal network allowed boats to dock right next to their warehouses.
Now, what's really interesting is the sheer scale of their ambition, which can basically be summed up by this number: 33,000. Back in the 1200s, Venice entered into its biggest business deal yet. The Pope brokered an arrangement with Venice's elected leader, Enrico Dandolo, to produce ships and arms for an anticipated 33,000 crusaders. Venice went all in, investing huge amounts of the Republic's money to make it happen. But imagine throwing a massive, ridiculously expensive party for 33,000 soldiers, and only a third of them actually show up. Oh, and nobody brought their wallets? Less than half the promised payment was made. It was the ultimate medieval breach of contract, and Venice was left holding this enormous bill. As you can probably guess, their leader, Enrico Dandolo, was absolutely furious. So, Dandolo pivots to what is essentially history's most dramatic collection agency tactic. Since he suddenly had a massive fleet and a heavily indebted army just sitting there ready to go, he simply redirected the crusading army to attack Venice's own Christian rivals, including the mighty Constantinople. This was a bold, ruthless campaign that completely eliminated their competition and successfully laid the true foundation for Venice's sprawling overseas empire.
That takes us right into Section 4, Art, Innovation, and eventually, Decline. By the time of the Renaissance, merchants like Marco Polo had massively expanded their trade routes, turning the Republic into a vibrant hub of intellect. And what's cool is how their practical, maritime industries directly birthed extravagant art and innovation. Look at their sail-making industry. They had these massive looms, which were brilliantly repurposed to create the vast canvases that Renaissance painters are so famous for today. Their craftsmen, flush with trade money, pioneered brand-new printing techniques. And their extravagant glassworks industry was directly fueled by silica-rich sands brought down from nearby rivers. Trade and art were completely intertwined.
Now, to get the full picture, we also need to objectively look at the darker realities of this immense trade dominance. Because, in addition to art, silks, and spices, the Venetians also actively traded enslaved peoples to work in private homes or on their ships. Once freed, some of these individuals remained in the city and actually found work in iconic roles, like becoming gondoliers, navigating the city's canal system.
Let's move forward and see how this all builds toward their eventual decline. Venice's dominance remained pretty much unchallenged until the mid-15th century, when Ottoman expansion really started interfering with their business. Around the same time, new transoceanic trade routes were discovered that entirely bypassed Venice. Fast forward to 1797, and French attacks finally forced the Republic to dissolve. Over the next few decades, the city rapidly traded hands back and forth between Austria and France, before finally being permanently ceded to Italy in 1866.
Which brings us to our fifth and final section, the modern crisis.
So the crucial point is that, unable to compete commercially anymore, Venice survived by completely reinventing itself as a global tourist destination. But that very reinvention brings us to the existential threat the city faces today. Rising sea levels are threatening to finally sink the floating city. Let's put this into perspective. In the year 1900, the historic Basilica di San Marco flooded about 7 times a year. Compare that to today, where that exact same structure experiences roughly 250 annual floods. That is a rapid, devastating acceleration, and it's an immediate daily threat to the city's survival.
And compounding that environmental crisis is the tourism industry itself. You have millions of annual visitors speeding along the canals in modern motorboats. Well, the wake from these boats actively erodes the muddy barrier that protects Venice's ancient wooden foundations. It's this incredibly tragic juxtaposition. The genius ancient engineering meant to protect and seal the mud is now being actively torn apart by our modern convenience.
So, what does this all mean for the future? It leaves us with a pretty heavy question to consider. Will our modern advances destroy a 1,500-year-old miracle? Venice's story is the ultimate testament to human ingenuity. I mean, a literal city willed into existence out of the mud. But left unaddressed, it might just become a cautionary tale of human ambition colliding with nature. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a totally new perspective on the truly impossible empire